Well, John, your work I know well, and I'm an avid reader of Foreign Policy and Focus, so you need no introduction. And Anne, your bona fides have been laid out by Metta. And in fact, I want to make sure that early in this discussion, we hit up Anne and Metta uh, with the question about the current developments in the U.S. Senate and the other branches of government, and what this new, well, first of all, is the U.S. going to be a permanently liberal country now? Is it going to be possible for conservatives for a third time in the last half century to find a way to unite the moral/social conservatives with the fiscal/government minimizing conservatives? They did it with Reagan, they did it with George W. Bush, somehow they did it with Trump. But we have this new current. The people who are today leading the attempt to subvert the election are led by this guy, Senator Josh Hawley, who has a whole ideology that he calls anti-liberalism or values conservatism, which is a social conservative government minimizing movement. How does that compare to other tendencies like that you've seen and studied and analyzed over the years? Is it going to be hard to put the cork back in the bottle for conservatives in the United States?
Well, if you want my take on this, I have a very different take. So first of all, I think thinking of this as conservatism is just the wrong category completely. But I think there is, the way I see the world is that the transformations brought about by really globalization and automation, which disrupted livelihoods and communities for many, many people, and the growing gap between the educated and the less educated. So I think the key phrase here is Trump saying, I love the less educated. Well, he sure does. And so I think we want to understand how that if you look at all the social science data, it shows this huge and widening gap between basically people with a college education and more and people with a high school education and less. Their patterns of family life have diverged almost completely. So, you know, the interest in values, for example, and family values and church is a way for people who have lost secure family attachment to try to hold on to a vision of what family and coherence and community could be like when they've really lost it. And the term I would use is to differentiate. It's an old term that goes back to Robert Merton in sociology, locals versus cosmopolitans. It was also used by Alvin Goldner. And I think that's the split we have. And that's why rural areas and small towns and the less educated are forming a block. And then, of course, the interesting question is why that block has ended up aligned with the grotesquely wealthy capitalist class that wants, you know, ever more liberal tax policy and so on and so forth. But I think it is fair to say that the Democrats, my party, the liberals, quote unquote, really have become the party of educated cosmopolitan. I don't know if you want to call us elites, because not everyone in that group is, but the coalition that is, that, I mean, that's why even thinking of this as a coalition of minorities has turned out really not to be true. So anyway, if you think about the real losses in that population of people who are inevitably more dependent on their local community, more stressed when its job base is undermined, when its churches don't have enough members anymore, they depend on that community in a way that, and this is just the last point I'll make, that if you're an educated person, if you go elsewhere, not where you were from, you have all sorts of, I hate these terms, but human capital and social capital that's portable, that is, you're legible to people you've never met. You say, oh, yes, I have a degree from Berkeley, or yes, I have a BA from so-and-so, and I'm a such and what tech. If you're the person who was the star of your high school football team, and you're known to everyone in your town, and you can sell insurance there or have a car dealership and be very widely respected in your community. But if that community goes under, you don't have anything you can take elsewhere. And you are really dependent. And that's true for people who are quite poor, who are dependent literally on the help other church members give them when they're out of work, or a group of friends who pool their resources in order to be able to sort of survive, all the way up to relatively elite people whose status and sense of meaning in the world is attached to that place. And so the idea that you can just compensate people with job training programs and, I think it just misreads the situation. So what I've tried to understand is why people are as infuriated as they are and as willing to back any politics they see as destroying the existing order. And that is an extremely dangerous thing, but that's where I think we are. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I like that analysis a lot. And one thing that strikes me looking at the United States through that lens, though, is that the liberal cosmopolitans are a demographic majority now and growing. I saw an analysis in the New York Times that said that the proportion of Americans without, the proportion of voting age Americans without post-secondary education fell by something like 5% just between 2016 and 2020, which was more than enough to account for Biden's margin over 2016. Yeah. Is the solution? I mean, Canada engaged in this huge mass experiment, basically expanding post-secondary education by something like 20% over 20 years. And it, first of all, didn't cause the expected decline in economic or social outcomes from tertiary education, but also might help prove an insulation barrier against certain types of populist, angry politics.
Yeah,
demographics on the side of the Democrats?
I mean, I agree with that very strongly. I think the problem is that the current coalition that has been running the country has reduced public spending on every front. And that includes, there's been a huge decrease in investments in higher education. So almost all public, let's forget about the private universities, but the public universities, which were the ones that did just what you're talking about in the 1950s and 60s. There was huge expansion. I mean, Metta and I were both beneficiaries of the University of California system with its enormous system of, what occur in public universities and public four-year colleges and public two-year colleges, New York State system, the Ohio University of Ohio system. Ohio State expanded the number of students it had from 15,000 to 65,000. University of Arizona and Arizona State likewise just grew enormously. Those investments have not kept up with population in the US. And so not only has college become very expensive, which is the sort of Bernie Sanders make tuition free, which actually wouldn't help at all. You need more places, you need more investments, you need more money going. And public investment is just being squeezed on every front. So unless you could get a US government that was enlightened enough to raise much more in taxes in order to fund much more in public goods, I don't see how you can get there. And that's, so I'll just say the last thing about me is that what I'm really interested in is how do you get the kinds of institutions that can represent the public good? And it seems to me we are eroding those both from the left and the right. The suspicion and hate, that is, I don't think AOC is any closer to understanding the need for effective institutions that can find the public good than, well, I won't say than Donald Trump is, but than the Republican Party is. So, what about John? Do you have some comments here?
Well, agree with you completely about the split here in the United States, and this is something Metta and Doug, I'm sure, have followed as well. The Poland A, Poland B split between exactly what you're talking about, between predominantly rural, less educated parts of Poland and the cosmopolitan centers. And the reason I bring that up is because it's not as if this emerged in Eastern Europe before the United States or other parts of the world, but I think it had a political impact there before we saw political impact here, for instance, in the United States. So the backlash against liberalism, actually took place, you could argue, in the mid to late 90s throughout the region. So if we want to, I think, understand how to successfully deal with that or unsuccessfully deal with that, we can look at Eastern Europe for some lessons. The question of education, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, education would be very valuable for, I think, helping infrastructural investment into education would be very valuable. Bearing in mind two things. One, that the Republicans are banking on the fact that, the trends, Doug, you were talking about, simply strengthen Democratic strongholds and don't necessarily reach into the areas that Republicans are counting on, and that the Electoral College and the Senate and institutions of that nature preserve, along with voter suppression, et cetera, Republican advantages. So I think institutional change at that political level is necessary to alleviate this challenge. Also, bearing in mind the Robert Reich, I remember back in the 90s, said, look, if we put investments into secondary and education, then we will get to the next American Revolution. We will, be able to transcend our political and economic problems. And that turned out not to be true. I mean, it turned out to be another version of the talented 10th, the W.E.B. Du Bois argument about the African American community. So yes, I think we definitely do have to put those investments there, but I do think we also have to look at areas of the country and segments of the country where either education is not the answer, or even if there is further education provided, it's not going to lift up folks or solve the problems in their community. And there too, I think, the point you made about infrastructural development is key. So of course, I too, and this is the last point I'll make, I too am skeptical about job retraining just as a way of solving our problem here. But as a political issue, I do think the emphasis on jobs is what the Biden administration has to do. So whether the jobs program is another word for infrastructural development, because God knows infrastructure development is not sexy and is not going to get votes for anybody if it's phrased like that. But if it's phrased as jobs, and for instance, a Green New Deal is not going to make it in the United States under that phrase. But as a jobs program, yes, that's something that you can say, anybody who opposes it, they're opposing jobs. And that is, I think, a political suicide in this country.
I want to take my turn by reminding Ann where she and I met. We worked for Seymour Martin Lipset on a book called The Radical Right. And Doug has dated this little conflict back a few years, but not all the way back to the 60s when we met. And in fact, that book, I think, actually was kind of an analysis of what was to come, because we had two different types of people in the Republican Party or supporting the right wing. And one would be right-wing zealots. We called them, I think, rednecks. And they were the uneducated, hicks and bigots. And then we had the upper class people like Romney, people with high education, high status, lot of money behind them and so on. And somehow they canceled each other out and to some extent reduced the impact of the events that were going on at the time. I remember when I arrived in Boston, the busing issue was hot. There was a lot of opposition to busing children to interracial schools. And so, I mean, I think the conclusion that Lipset reached was so far these two strains within conservatism have canceled each other out enough to contain the tendency for the radical right to maybe get in power, but don't count on it. I think, you know, the last pages of his book warn this, you can't be sure that they won't eventually get in charge. And so here we have Donald Trump. And but again, the still, to me, amazing thing is the coalition between ignorant people and rich people, because we have, on the one hand, by the way, I spent some time looking, a couple of weeks, trying to figure out the exit polls. And the exit polls show very little correlation with things that you would expect. Education and income really don't amount to anything except at the extreme ends. The support for Trump didn't vary worth 5 percentage points or something until you got up to the postgraduate level, and then you have a big jump in support for liberal positions, masters and up. And those are the professional people. The things that, if you look at where you get big differences of support for Trump or Biden, it occurs only really in two demographic areas. One has to do with race, black, white, and the other has to do with rural, urban. The rural and the urban people are totally different and miles apart. And then the other non-demographic factors that I noticed that had big effects were simply cultural things: gun control, abortion, gay rights, gay marriage, the usual array of issues that culturally divide us. But surprisingly, I don't think the demographics account for anything like as much as they should. And so my own view is that the real issue has not to do, here I am, an anti-Marxist. It isn't Marxian. It's not about class. It's about status. And it's about feeling disrespected and not given the kind of recognition and honor that a person should have. And so that's everything that I've seen indicates that the people who have the most anger are people who feel that they are not as high on the totem pole as they belong, and that would be white sovereigntists or whatever. And when I sent my paper along this line to Adam and Arlie Hochschild, Arlie hasn't replied yet, and I may be in touch with her. Not much, but Adam replied and said, this is what Arlie is saying. Arlie is now hanging out. Not only did she write that book about Louisiana and the Tea Party, where that was sort of her conclusion on it, wasn't real emphatic. She didn't say absolutely money has nothing to do with it, but it seemed to me pretty much that was what it meant. But she's now going to Appalachia and hanging out with neo-Nazis, and writing a book about that. And he says that's what she's thinking too. So I don't know whether I can't quote anybody any further than that, but I'm sure eager to talk to Arlie when she gets a minute. And can you give me an update on what Arlie is doing and whether what I've said is true or false?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I do see her, and she's thriving, and she's still Zooming like mad with various people in whatever little town in Kentucky, the sort of former coal mining area. I think she's actually, she's in very close touch with, these aren't neo-Nazis, actually, they're just plain old Nazis. But anyway, so she's in very close touch with a couple of them. She's managed to, get them confiding in her and so forth. I think, however, that she has not really managed to get yet less educated, current, angry Trump supporters. These are former, repentant, very interesting, very, very interesting people. But, and she's, her as, I do, as this enormously engaging human being who manages to find emotional connections to everyone she deals with. So I'm sure eventually she will do that. But I think her access to the really angry Trump supporter types is actually not yet. Again, she's got former and repentant and insightful people from that same background. So that's for sure. So anyway, I think she's hugely engaged in this and having a lot of fun doing it. That's would be my report from the field. Okay. But I want to go back to this claim that education really has no effect. And I actually don't. It's not a Marxist argument, but it is a structural. I think you cannot. Let me see two things. And one, I'm very interested in the Poland example and indeed the Canada example. These populist rage against current elites seems to be very widespread across many, many countries. So any explanation that's unique to the US with its history of chattel slavery, for example, doesn't really explain why Hungary and Poland and France and Italy and Britain have gone in some ways similar directions. So anyway, I believe, and I don't know how far I would push this argument, but that a globalizing economy and very high levels of immigration really do create a threat for people who are locals. So in the same way that they create positive spin-offs for us, immigrants, not only make the world go round and, make all the cheap restaurants that serve wonderful, exotic, interesting food possible and so forth. But, if you grew up in an era where there was no such thing as 4 different kinds of Chinese food, and we have a Chengdu restaurant right on, I don't know if it'll survive COVID, but anyway, and that is something where, there's basically a vat of red pepper flakes in every single dish, and the food is fantastic if you don't die if your throat doesn't close up from the red chili flakes. But that kind of very cosmopolitan attitude, which is, oh yes, wonderful, the richness of our culture and religious diversity and blah, 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 is just wonderful and it enhances life. That just is not how many, many people experience the world. And second, we know economically that wages have gone down and work hours have gone up, and that particularly for people with less education, they can no longer get jobs that support a male wage, I'll use that term, that allow them to have self-respect. So this huge sensitivity about feeling disrespected and you've lost status, you actually have lost status.
Yeah.
If you can't support your family and therefore you can't marry. So I would take Andy Cherlin's book about Labor's Love Lost. He's the demographer who studied family change, and the title, which is a horrible title if you ask me, but it's meant to convey this message, which is as work changes and the nature of working class jobs have changed, people have lost the fundamental source of identity and self-respect that structures, ordinary life for most real people. So,
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add that
Please,
I would agree that the globalization really is the economic impact of globalization is at root cause. But it's not just the economic changes, it's the political response to globalization. The fact that the mainstream parties of both the center left and center right largely supported these policies of globalization, the national versions of them, and that they have thus suffered at the polls as a result. And ordinarily you would have, a party of the further to the left, a communist party offering some kind of an alternative, but generally speaking, it hasn't. I mean, if the classic example would be in Eastern Europe, where the former communist parties generally embraced, rather fast track economic transformation associated with globalization. And we know from the data, the electoral data, that in a lot of key countries, supporters of communist parties switched over to the far right. I mean, you look in Italy, you look at France, it's quite stark. So, and then the third, so if you have the economic changes, you have the political backlash against the parties that supported it, and then the third being the social/cultural. And what you described about the United States actually applies even more so to Europe, because the mobility in Europe in general, up until very recently, was far less than in the United States. I mean, the United States, and I'm not sure about Canada. I mean, you guys would have to fill me in on this, but in the United States, people move all around. There's an incredible movement if you look at where people are versus where they were born. In Europe, not so much until recently. People, and this was not necessarily even a question of education, but people would stay near where they were born, and there was much greater sense of community with long-standing families, lineage, and genealogy, and so forth. But that has changed as a result of globalization, and and immigration is perceived as a challenge to that. Whether it is or not is another question. So I think those three things help to explain to a certain extent the phenomenon of right-wing populism being, asserting or providing some kind of an alternative, both to a mainstream embrace of globalization and the failure of the left to provide any viable alternative.
Poland is funny that way, in part because it remains much more rural than pretty much any other country in the European Union. It's still close to 50% agrarian, partly as a consequence of how decommunization happened. The communists never collectivized agriculture, so people retreated back to their family farms as sort of a welfare backstop in the 1990s. But the divide between Poland A and Poland B isn't just, and I'm just speaking as someone who's covered a lot of elections there, and I did a book chapter in rural Poland and stuff like that, isn't just rural urban, because there's a geographic line, and on the right-hand side of it, people vote for PIS overwhelmingly. On the left-hand side of it, they vote for Civic Forum. And it is, the part on the right is mainly rural and agrarian, and in fact not very commercial agrarian. I call it Europe's last peasants, which isn't quite accurate, but the European Union experience after 2004 had an effect on one side of Poland that caused resentments on the other side of Poland. What's interesting is that the million Poles who moved to France and Britain and Ireland and Scotland, France and England and Ireland and Scotland after 2004, a lot of them moved back to Poland. Most of those Poles were from villages. They were rural, and they moved to and got what were considered crappy jobs in Western Europe, but were good jobs by a rural Poles standard, and some acculturation in the urban areas where they worked. And a lot of them moved back after the economy collapsed in 2008. And it was what they called J-turn migration, which is they went from a village in Poland to a city in Western Europe, and then they returned not to the village, but to a city in Poland, which helped propel some people say it helped propel sort of the high-tech boom in the Polish Silicon Valley of Silesia and that sort of thing. But I think it also, and this is purely a guess on my part, helped contribute to the real polarization of Poland, because it was right around that time that the parties of the right, the Farmers' Party and the Catholic parties and the other parties of the far right coalesced into a single movement under the Kaczynskis, and really started to play on resentment of urban cosmopolitan Poland, and people in PIS, I remember even around like 2009, sitting down and talking to people in the PIS party, and they would just frankly say, well, it's those Jews, it's those Jews. They would say, they would say the Gazeta Wyborcza, which is the big liberal paper that was founded under the Solidarity movement. That's Jewish.
Wyborcza Gazeta?
Yeah.
And it's because they're Jewish?
This was the PIS view, was that the urban much as in the United States, the word cosmopolitanism, when used in a certain way, does have roots in this idea of a Jewish elite. And in Poland, it's much more explicit. Of course, in Poland, it's more absurd because, there isn't much of they killed everyone. There's to the extent that there's any Jewish elite, and yes, some well-known people are Jewish, but it's a racist conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. And so in Poland, it's a little different because you have the extreme Catholicism of the right, but you also have this regional divide. Now, to further complicate things, the dotted line between the PIS supporting half of Poland and the Civic Forum supporting half of Poland also coincides fairly closely with the parts of Poland that used to be Germany and those that didn't. Probably not because they used to be Germany, but because, although maybe there was existing civic infrastructure, but also because those places were repopulated after the war with people forced marched in from ethnic Poles who were forced marched in from Ukraine and wherever else. So they might have had a bit of a tabula rasa experience and less of a sense of lifelong connection to the land and all that. Again, just a guess. Poland's pretty interesting this way, though.
That's absolutely true. And the interesting thing is that some of the depopulation of the countryside that we see throughout Eastern Europe isn't as strong in Poland for some of the reasons that you're pointing out. And although you see high levels of poverty in those areas or deindustrialization or what have you, it's not like Bulgaria, for instance. Bulgaria lost one of the largest outflows of people in history, in modern history, not as a result of famine or war. People just left the country. And this was largely a brain drain.
They left to go work in the EU?
They went to work in the EU, to study in the EU, to take jobs in the EU, to, just leaving, and to the United States, not just to the EU, but of course it was easier to travel to the EU. But you had this phenomenon where the best and the brightest would leave the country, and then the second best and brightest would leave the countryside to go to the city. And so that meant that you have large sections of Bulgaria, and this actually applies to a number of countries in Eastern Europe, but you could see this in other countries as well. You see this in the United States, just the countryside emptying out, and there being nothing left except older folks and babies and children were sent to live with their grandparents because the parents are both working. So you have nobody of working age in the countryside. And so that too, I think, has a political impact, and is taken advantage of by certain political parties.
The hollow villages is a big phenomenon in so many countries, these villages where everybody's either over 65 or under 18. In Romania, I've visited a lot of them. All the working age people have gone to Italy or Spain. They like to go to those countries for linguistic reasons. But in China, of course, it's the biggest thing. There's 200 million working age adults who are officially in their villages, but physically in a city somewhere else. And yeah, what does that do to politics? Does the United States have a version of that? Do we see an aging demographics in rural America pushing voting trends?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, it's not only a kind of emptying out of the countryside, but a tremendous homogenization of the countryside. I mean, what once had been, lots of different traditions and, family farms and small businesses has, been hit by globalization to kind of even it all out. So, you can drive through America in some parts and not come across a family restaurant. It's just, a chain restaurant. And then the small farms have been, pushed out of business or consolidated at a larger level into huge combines. So what had once been, and this I think speaks to what had once been a thriving tradition in the United States and the Midwest of kind of quirky politics, as a result of a really diverse, set of factors, has disappeared. You no longer have the kind of, the progressive, movements coming out of the Midwest. That has been a profound political. It has had a profound political impact.
How much correlation is there now between education and rural urban residents? I assumed that people in the countryside just plain don't have anything like the same level of education. But I read someplace that that the rural education has improved a lot in the US. I just don't know how much and how big that gap is. How much can you, well, you can't explain the rural differences by education, because education doesn't matter that much at the level in which, unless you get to the, professional levels of education. And in my opinion, that you can't explain something big by something weak. But still, the question for me is, how backward are these folks?
I think it's framed the wrong way if you look at it in a static sense, as these folks in the country and what's rural education like. Because of course, the way education manifests itself in rural places is you get out of those rural places and you go to a university. And I think this new technique of mapping socioeconomic mobility by microgeography, by economists like Raj Chetty and Miles Korak here in Canada, who've merged the census data for hundreds of millions of people with the tax returns of multiple generations of them, and therefore can map down to the county level what your odds are of making more money than your parents. The thing about that technique, of course, is it shows what your odds are of making more money than your parents by mapping people who've moved out of that place, as well as. So we found, when I worked with Miles Korak on a map of Canada by microgeography of socioeconomic mobility, we found that rural Alberta has extremely high rates of socioeconomic mobility measured this way. Interestingly, we also found that southwestern Ontario registers very positive. Rural Manitoba registers very badly. The odds are that you make no more money than your parents. But southwestern Ontario registers very high, which is interesting because during the period of study, he was tracking people who were in their 40s in the 1980s, and their children when they were in the 40s, 40 years later. Southwestern Ontario suffered a huge economic collapse and a huge rise of unemployment and rising poverty rate. It's a Rust Belt area. Yet it saw a huge increase in positive socioeconomic mobility during this period. And the main explanation that he offered was the 401 highway, which allowed people to fairly easily leave where they were from and go to the universities in London, Ontario, and Toronto and Windsor, and do better. And I mean, I think you have to measure places by the people who've left, as well as there. I said that I spent some time in Germany this past year trying to do that with post-reunification ex-DDR Eastern Germany. You can't measure that stuff in Germany because that type of data assembly is not allowed. But if you did, you would probably see the eastern states of Germany as being places of extremely positive socioeconomic mobility, particularly for women of the generation who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s. So I guess and this is a question that fascinates me. Do you improve outcomes in these rural places by improving the institutions in these rural places, or by making it easier for people to leave?
Mm-hmm. And your initial tentative answer?
See, my own work is looking at this in the urban sense, in that I find the I'm looking at places in the urban outskirts that have become mobility traps, as I'm lazily calling them. And the Raj Chetty answer, the American answer, is make it easier to leave. There's all these moving to opportunity programs in the United States that make it easy for people to get out of housing projects. And because, of course, Chetty's own conclusions out of this analysis was that if you take a family that has low rates of intergenerational mobility and you move them into a new geography that has a high rate of mobility, the family adopts that new neighborhood's rate very quickly, like within a few years. And Hurricane Katrina showed that the families that moved to Houston and stayed there saw better outcomes for their children than those who stayed. But that's a very American answer, is the way we deal with places that have become traps is you pay people to get out of that place. And the flip side of that coin is you're still left with that place they left, right? And by them leaving, by the more ambitious and hopeful people leaving, you're making that place even worse. And I think that comes close to what Ann's talking about with a lot of these places, is that a lot of programs de facto were oriented toward encouraging the more ambitious and hopeful people to leave and the more cosmopolitan-minded people to leave, and didn't really answer the question of what's left. And of course, the problem is that the politics of the United States and many other countries, the politics of the right are what I would call the tyranny of geography. These parties win victories by campaigning in the places where nobody lives, or where hardly anybody lives. Mm-hmm. And the United States has an electoral system based on geography, not on demography. So if you're turning the places where hardly anyone lives into places where only hopeless people are left, then you get the politics.
That explains right there a hell of a lot right there.
I mean, you say this is the American way, and you're right, unfortunately, but it wasn't always the American way. And I mean, if you looked at the rural extension programs that were set up, during the FDR period, I think those were designed for people to stay where they were and benefit from the knowledge of advanced farming techniques. It wasn't you had to go away somewhere to get that. It actually came to your community and provided you with that knowledge. Today, I mean, I have good friends up in Vermont in the dairy community, in northern Vermont, and the family I'm closest to, the children have gone off to various parts, but the eldest son, in a kind of example of primogeniture, the eldest son went to University of Vermont, got trained in the latest techniques. It wasn't a rural extension program that came to the community. He had to go to UVM to get this training, and then return to the farm, and has been able to survive all of the fluctuations in the market because he has the advanced computer training, finance training, to be able, as a family farmer, to survive in this highly competitive environment. But he's only able to do so because he got that training and brought it back. And that, I think, is unfortunately, the more proof of what you're talking about, which is, again, a kind of talented 10th approach. There will be some who'll be able to go, get that knowledge and come back, but it's not really geared. The system is not geared for that kind of result. It's geared for people to go off to university and go somewhere else, not back to their community. And there are very few programs designed to bring the knowledge directly to the specific community so that the community can thrive, not just a given individual or a given farmer.
But just take the fact that what you're saying, I think both of you are saying that the rural areas remain backward. I don't know how backward. I think that's a really important question. But the system of voting is it gives way more influence to rural areas. So the future is not all that bright. As the Democrats say, well, we're gaining population because all of these educated people are, the trend is in the direction of democratic voting. That's true, except that the system is set up so that the rural people are still going to have more, their votes count for more. And unless that is changed, I don't see all that much reason for optimism for liberal persuasion.
Well, I would again, first of all, I think we should avoid the term backward.
I'm sorry.
I just would be careful. Speaking as, cosmopolitan elites ourselves, I think it's really, you have to be careful not to disrespect. But I would see things a little bit differently. And I think Georgia is really, really interesting in this respect, which is, the most radical thing, say, a Biden administration could do is put a huge high-tech hub for healthcare or green projects in North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming. And when you start to have a new kind of economy, a more modern economy that's thriving as the society changes, you actually do change the political base. And I think, of course, the Georgia story is about, the mobilization of the African-American vote. And Stacey Abrams is a goddess, in my view. But that isn't the main thing that's changed. The main thing that's changed is that Atlanta and its suburbs have become a very modern city with a high-tech economy with, lots of educated people. It always had a lot of universities, both historically Black colleges and historically white, I should say, which was probably the truth. And so I think it is not inevitable that states that are, quote, rural, I mean, yes, the US Constitution is very weird. It was created on, the premise that all these small states needed to be able to block what big states did. And you're not going to be able to change that. That's the concept. I mean, there's no way that these states are going to sign on to voting away their political power. It's not going to happen. But I think that it is imaginable for the cosmopolitan economy to spread to states. I think Montana is actually a good example of this. It's got a relatively small population. It's I've never been there, but it's supposed to be extremely beautiful. So it's a place people want to move. And with all this high tech, you're zooming anyway, a lot of people have moved there, and more people, probably educated people, probably will move there. And that's a base for both, fancy tourism industry and for other kinds of high tech green type. So I think that's the more plausible route by which the change could happen, not changing the Constitution, but having the economy spread its more dynamic parts away from the coasts and to some other places. But I think the other thing is just to try to really take account, and I guess this is the last point I'll make, of the legitimate reasons for rage in the parts of the country and the parts of the population who've been screwed by the changes that have benefited other segments. And the one we see most clearly, of course, is all the money flowing to the richest, hedge fund managers and God knows what at the top, and the hollowing out of middle class. But there is also the real costs, I think, of, again, globalization and immigration. And I think those are the two substantive issues that Trump ran on. He hated NAFTA, and he in fact got rid of it. He hated immigration, and he in fact slowed it down. So I think that not just believing that the people who follow him are crazy people who've been brainwashed by Fox News. I just think it weakens if you have no actual analysis of what went on. So my last contribution to this, and then I have to get off because I have a bunch of things I have to finish today, but I have read with such pleasure, I can hardly describe it, this recent biography of John Maynard Keynes called The Price of Peace. And it's just literally the best book I've read in years. I think the author is someone named Carter. And I have to say, I actually listened to it as an audiobook rather than reading it, but it's great. And the last, I'd say 20% of that book deals with the period after Keynes's death, when Keynesianism was distorted into unrecognizability in the US. And you see that process. And you see, I'm sorry to say, the Democratic administrations. The Clinton administration is the poster child. But these transformations, the people who are mad, there is some logic to their being mad at us, I'll just say. So if you read that book, and the whole book is just enthrallingly fascinating, fascinating. And it really talks about what it means to develop an economics that is meant to protect society and human life. And since we need that more than anything to preserve the planet in the long run, the whole perspective about the relationship between moral life and formal economics is just totally fascinating. But that last section really tells you that you have to rethink what we took for granted as okay in our politics. So that's my view.
I would endorse that, and also endorse your comment about the changes that are taking place between urban and rural. I mean, Doug mentioned the high-tech corridor in Silesia. I mean, Silesia is was a mining area that was hit the hardest by the economic transformations, and so that has led to a revival there.
What region? Sorry, I didn't get it, John.
Silesia in Poland.
Oh, okay. I don't
formerly
know
German.
even.
And on the lower left-hand side of Poland.
Okay.
And COVID, not just COVID, but other things, I mean, climate change, any number of factors are actually may conspire to push people out of cities and into, if not exactly rural areas, exurban areas and places like that. So we may in fact see a distribution of money and power as a result of this. And that could have a profound impact on politics. I think that'd be very—
Yeah, but you were proposing that we talk about jobs and really emphasize the infrastructure, changing the infrastructure. I think the investment in that is obviously a great thing to do, but I don't see that those jobs are going to really change the culture, because these are going to be people making highways and, more airports or sewers or something like that. I mean, it's not, they won't be farming, but it isn't really a different kind of role or status.
When I've seen speculation like John's talking about, where it says, well, a lot of people are, if they can work from anywhere, they're going to move to a rural area. We haven't seen a lot of that happening real estate prices have not fallen in cities, but it could happen. The problem with it, I see in terms of changing electoral outcomes, is that people tend to want to move not to any random place in a rural area, but they want to move to a college town or a ski town or somewhere that already has a lot of Democrats in it.
it's interesting to see what happens, in areas. I mean, for instance, Virginia has become transformed from a red state to basically a blue state. And it's not just the college towns, although those do contribute to it, but it's a process of folks moving further and further away. And that could be reproduced in other places, but it's true that, I mean, Montana, Wyoming, I mean, if you look at that, they do go to these, the only places in those states that might have a Chengdu restaurant. They're not going to go to any place. So there is definitely going to be.
I would say, I don't know about Canada, but in the US, New York and San Francisco have basically been depopulated. I think some measurable percentage of all the people living in San Francisco have left, because the logic is, if I have to work from home anyway, why am I paying $4,000 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment or a tiny studio when I could be living somewhere I can afford to live and have actually a yard or a garden and go outside my house, and have a real world. I don't have to be here. And so now we don't know whether post-COVID, these places will all rebound and everyone will say, oh, the restaurants are so good, the museums are so good, the culture is so much more interesting. But I think all my friends who live in New York aren't in New York. They're all living, they're wealthy enough to basically decamp from the apartments they live in New York and be somewhere, renting a place or something in upstate New York. So it's horrible in the sense that they've been able to escape the plague because of their privilege. But I'm not sure. I think at this exact moment, I know rents have fallen dramatically in San Francisco because nobody is there.
Well, upstate New York and the Central Valley of California could really benefit from a repopulation from
people are moving to those gold mining towns. They're both now Republican House seats.
Yeah,
Kevin McCarthy should be aware that the urban elites are moving into his turf. Yeah,
it's partly because both, especially San Francisco, but also New York City, have been suffering for quite some time from an artificially low population density and high housing price caused by existing elites' refusal to allow more housing to be built. And I think COVID made a lot of people say, screw it, let's just get out of here. Now, the question is there a reserve population of elite people living in second-tier cities who've been waiting for any downturn in housing prices in New York and San Francisco to move to?
I'm going to get off. It was really fascinating talking to you. And Doug, I'd love to know more about this mobility work you've done.
All right. You're dismissed, Ann Swidler.
Thank you.
You did well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pass my love around Berkeley, just sort of spray the city.
Okay, will do.
Bye-bye. Okay.
And I think this has been a perfect hour long, sounding like the president talking about a perfect phone call, but perfect hour-long conversation.
Good. All right. It's been fun. And John, you and I have things to talk about your own work. I should mention to Doug that the thing that you and I have in common is we're both kind of obsessed by promoting more transnational interaction, civil society globally, and as opposed to just Canadian or American. And John is working along those lines and has plans that, are very similar to what I do with this project Save the World. But we haven't compared notes in a while, right, John?
True.
Right. So I'll get back in touch with you. Thank you both.
Both on. I'd like to be on with John again sometime too and hear more about what he's doing. So
yeah, that was fun. It was really interesting to hear what you've done.
I'll put you back on at another time. Anytime you want, I'll do it.